very happy to have a book event today on this book right here, Backstories, U.S. News, Productions, and Palestinian Politics, and very happy to have the author, Dr. Amahl Bishara, here to discuss the book. Amahl is an assistant professor of anthropology at Tufts University, and she filmed the documentary Across Oceans Among Colleagues in 2002, which follows the advocacy efforts of the New York-based Committee to Protect Journalists on behalf of journalists in the Middle East. The book is a really fascinating work on the role that Palestinians play in creating and influencing the narrative in U.S. reporting on the U.S. media and representations of the Palestinian issue here in the United States, and also the effect of those representations on Palestinian politics. And so I hope you join me in welcoming Professor Bishara to talk about backstories.
Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you especially to Yusuf Manayir and Samir Al-Qassam and Athena for all of your organizing and for the invitation. And deep thank you to all of you for coming. It's a pleasure and an honor to see so many wonderful friends and colleagues here who I know from so many parts of my life. This is a book about the production of U.S. news during the Second Palestinian Intifada. So it's actually an ethnography of news production. Most books and articles that you read about U.S. media are often about, the text themselves. How is this, what does this text mean? Is it biased this way or that way? These were questions that I pretty much left aside and instead chose to look at how this news is actually produced. What goes on the ground to bring us the text that we rely on every day? In some ways, this story started because during the Second Intifada, I would, wake up, stumble out of bed, walk to the front door of my apartment and pick up my newspaper as though it was a lifeline, because I felt that I needed to know what was going on in the occupied territories with such urgency, right? And as I was doing that, I started thinking, I'm really relying on these journalists who are bringing me this news. And I also realized that I wasn't just relying on the American foreign correspondents who had the bylines. I was relying on fixers, reporters, producers, photojournalists who were Palestinian, with whom those foreign correspondents work. So the foreign correspondents, the American foreign correspondents, cannot do the work that they do every day without those Palestinian journalists working alongside them. So I wanted to look at that process of collaboration up close. So it's really at the collaboration that is at the heart of U.S. news, but is often hidden, generally hidden. I'll come back to this photograph later, but this is what the cover image is taken from, but cropped down a little bit. So this is one of the first ethnographies of the Second Palestinian Intifada and its aftermath, and as such, it addresses some of the key themes and events of the Second Intifada. So I discuss everyday experiences of checkpoints and closure, Palestinian experiences during Israeli invasions, protests against the separation wall, Arafat's funeral, the 2005 presidential elections, smaller but still colorful local events such as the Pope Benedict's visit to Bethlehem, and of course violence against Palestinian journalists. But really what this is about is Palestinian experiences of and attitudes about journalism itself, especially international journalism. And I expect that most of you don't read anthropology when you're reading about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Very often we actually, we end up reading histories or political scientific works. And so I could talk at more length about why I think an anthropological approach is so valuable, but I'm just going to move through that for now. This is another starting point for my project. I produced the documentary Across Oceans Among Colleagues about the work of the Committee to Protect Journalists in the year 2001-2002. I had done an internship with the Committee to Protect Journalists the previous summer, and I was learning more about how restrictions on movement prevented Palestinian journalists from doing their jobs and thus prevented also us from receiving the kinds of news that we should receive because they were working for U.S. news organizations. And that fall, I also found out that Mazen Dana, a Palestinian cameraman working in his hometown of Reuters, had been working there for about a decade, was to receive a Press Freedom Award from the Committee to Protect Journalists. So I had the opportunity to produce a student film about his visit and about the work of the Committee to Protect Journalists. I'm just going to show you a little tiny clip from this.
Mazen has been, in the course of my work, he's been a recurring figure. And he's a guy that, really for 7 years has diligently gone out, despite knowing the risks, to cover this. And I think, he's suffered quite a bit. Not a lot of people have known. Journalists like Mazen, almost on a daily basis, face physical assaults by settlers who are trying to stifle any negative news coverage, beatings, they're kicked, punched, have objects thrown at them. And from the same standpoint, the Israeli soldiers who are there to protect the settlers often attack journalists themselves, pushing them around, beatings and things like that. There are certainly a number of journalists like Mazen and others who've been wounded by rocks and things thrown by Palestinian demonstrators. And certainly the most serious type of incident that we've seen are the number of shootings in which journalists covering events have been wounded by IDF rubber bullets or, in some cases, live ammunition. How do we get these news images from the West Bank, but there's a person behind that camera?
What sort of things were you talking to him about on the phone?
I asked him to pass along some videotapes, of him in action that we're going to incorporate into a montage that we play at the award ceremony. It'll be, edited and produced by our media person, Abby, who has experience in documentary filmmaking.
You'll see when you go through the footage, there's more than you could ever use. I mean, you could make an hour, you could cut a 30-minute piece.
اطلع مازن بسرعة الدبابة بتضرب من فوق الدبابة بتضرب طخ واحد منهم
There's more than you could ever use.
When I spoke with Mazen yesterday.
Okay, I'm just going to show you one more minute from when Mazen was receiving his award.
قوتي تأتي من دعم ومساندة الزملاء في الدفاع عن الحقيقة وضد الذين يريدون إخمادها.
It gives me strength to know that our colleagues around the world are supporting us in the quest for truth against those who seek to stifle it.
الكلمة أمانة والصورة حق، ولذلك سأستمر في عملي بالرغم من جميع المصاعب حتى لو كلفني حياتي. بالأمس وقعت مأساة لأربع زملاء لنا في أفغانستان قتلوا من أجل إظهار الحق، وهي تبرهن على أن الحقيقة مهرها غالي. دعمكم لنا في خط المواجهة يعطينا الأمل. Finally, I thank CNG for their effort to protect the journalists and especially my colleague Joe Campanian for his support and always supporting us for that. Thank you.
I will say that I feel that I'm a better writer than a documentary maker, but at any rate, I really think it's very important to share this story because sadly I never saw Mazen again. Mazen went on assignment to Iraq in 2003 to cover the U.S. invasion for Reuters and its aftermath, and on August 17, 2003 he was killed outside the Abu Ghraib prison, shot by American forces. His death, to me, underscores how we rely on him and people like him for our news, even as he is endangered by our armies. So words and images are a public trust. Mazen Dana here, as he said this in his awards acceptance speech, is expressing, I think, a very familiar language, what journalism is and why it's important, right? So how do Palestinian journalists fit into the set of news values that we're familiar with in American journalism? Obviously, one of those central values is objectivity. Objectivity seems like what Tim Mitchell might call a principle that's true in every country. It seems to have this universal reach. But as Tim Mitchell also goes on to point out, those things which seem to be a principle true in every country in some easy, simple way are often not, right? So objectivity is not a universal value that operates the same way in all of these different places around the world. So, for example, if you think about what it requires to be an objective journalist in Jerusalem, or to seem objective in Jerusalem, is very different than what it takes to, for example, what it took to be an objective journalist in Moscow during the Cold War, or perhaps working in apartheid South Africa, right? So objectivity itself changes shapes in different places, and so I want to examine what are the contours and the demands and limitations of objectivity at this particular site. A key word for me was this idea of balance. Oftentimes when journalists think about objectivity, they think, okay, the way to be objective in Jerusalem is to be balanced and to bring the Palestinian side and the Israeli side. They do this often within texts, so that, for example, they choose terminology that they think of as not taking one side or the other. They also sometimes do it with quotes, so they'll bring a quote from an Israeli official and a Palestinian official, or an Israeli activist and a Palestinian activist, or something like this. And they do it in other ways as well. And the effect, unfortunately, of this strategy is that it gives the sense that the conflict itself is balanced, right, between the Israeli side and the Palestinian side, which, as we know, is not true in terms of the power dynamics on the ground, and not true either in terms of the moral and ethical claims of each side either. The other problem with it is perhaps a bit more subtle, which is that to present these two sides, for example, through this dialogue of quotes between an Israeli official and a Palestinian official, is actually to misrepresent the communicative space of this conflict itself. The truth is, it's not easy for Palestinians and Israelis to be in dialogue. There are structures in place that inhibit Palestinians from speaking to Israelis. The wall is one of those structures. Checkpoints are another of those structures. A system of permits and passes. Many, many things that prevent Palestinians and Israelis from having the kind of a dialogue that shows up in our newspapers as though it could happen, right? So it's sort of a subtle misrepresentation of this communicative space. The other thing about balanced objectivity is that it promotes the idea, I think very subtly, of the neutral American. And here I think what happens in a subtle way is that American journalists have been covering the peace process for decades now. In fact, it's of course one of the biggest storylines that they have been covering. And in a way they start to position themselves almost in the same way as the U.S. negotiator, outside and above the conflict, writing about it as this neutral outside person, right? And the problem with this is, and you can see this even in the sort of institutional structures of American journalism. An American journalist will have a staff including Israelis and Palestinians, and when they need to do a complicated story inside Israel, they'll work with with an Israeli fixer. And when they want to do a complicated story in the West Bank, they'll work with a Palestinian fixer or source or producer, right? So literally the institutional structure does have that sort of triangular shape, right? But the problem with seeing the American as outside and above is that it, of course, marginalizes the perspective of Israeli and Palestinian journalists, and especially Palestinian journalists, for ways that I can talk about more if you're interested. And in some ways it also reproduces U.S. power, because it gives that sense that the American is outside and above and neutral. Of course, just as we know that the United States is not an outside neutral negotiating party in the conflict, likewise, foreign correspondents are not outside and above this conflict. For one thing, during the Second Intifada, they were living right in the middle of it, right? So when they were concerned about political violence, they were concerned for their own families and for their own children. And most foreign correspondents, actually virtually all of them, were living in Israel. And so, for example, they were concerned about Palestinian political violence. Now, that shapes, surely, their sense of comfort and danger as they work. and journalists have complicated relationships also biographically to each side. So the idea of the neutral American is one that I would like to challenge and complicate it. And one way I've tried to do that is through this idea of what I call accumulated authorship. So back, when I was a grad student, I was, again, reaching for my paper every morning and reading these articles. And one time, it was a day when there had been, violence across Gaza and the West Bank. A lot of people had been killed in a lot of little incidents. It wasn't one big thing. And so there was a news article reporting this, and there was this one line that stood out, a quote from an old man whose son had died. And it went something like this: "My son's blood lay in a pool on the street like the blood of slaughtered sheep." Months later, when I got to the field, this quote was still in my head. I thought, what did this mean? I went in there thinking that perhaps this quote had been chosen because it was actually around this time of year, a little bit earlier, so it was around Easter and Passover, and I thought this quote has resonance with those holidays, perhaps. Obviously, it's also a color quote, if you will. It's vivid. Right, so maybe it was selected for that reason. I wasn't sure, but I wanted to figure it out. So I spoke to the Jerusalem-based producer who worked with the foreign correspondent, and I asked him, what did this quote mean? And he said, well, I think it means, he said, I think that the old man meant that the Israeli forces treat us like animals. And so, he saw his son dying like an animal, and that was the critique of the occupation, that they treat us like animals. He said, but I wasn't there, actually. I got this quote from a Nablus-based producer or fixer, and I can talk a little bit about why there's some ambiguity in those two terms. So, why don't you talk to him? So I went to Nablus, and I spoke to this Nablus-based fixer, and actually I arranged for him to take me to Abu Qaram himself. So we went through the streets of the old city. We met Abu Qaram. Abu Qaram told me the story of his son's death. But I, of course, frankly, did not have the interview skills to ask him exactly what he meant by this quote. So I never exactly found out what Abu Qaram thought this quote meant, but after the interview with Abu Qaram, I went back to the Nablus-based fixer who had taken me to Abu Qaram. I said, what do you think it means? He said, no. This old man was not making a political critique that the occupation treats us like animals. He was just describing what he saw. Because what happened was this man's son had been stopped by the Israeli soldiers, had been asked to take off his clothes, and he was a mentally disabled man. And so in the midst of all of this, eventually he was being detained, and he grew scared, and he started to run away. And the Israeli soldiers had shot him. And they had prohibited an ambulance from coming to help him. So the father was really just describing what was going on in front of him, from a lifetime of experiences of seeing sheep slaughtered, for example, on holidays or for other purposes, and there was just a lot of blood. So in doing that, we see these three different kinds of ways about thinking about this quote. Is it about religious imagery? Is it that Palestinians are treated like animals? Or is it just a description of events? So for me, what this signals to me is that you've got all of these people involved in producing this news story. And there are multiple relationships between the quote and the overarching narrative. It could mean this thing or that thing, right? And there's no problem with that. That always happens in communication, right? The complicated thing is that there's only one time in which there's an authoritative contextualization. One time when that quote sticks. It has one meaning kind of from there on out, and that's when it's published by the U.S. foreign correspondent. So I think we all have a challenge in front of us then in reading news about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or really anything else, which is to think about how can we recognize these multiple perspectives. It's actually almost impossible to imagine all the different perspectives and ideas that go into producing even one simple news story like this. But it's a challenge to us to recognize that complexity as we read the news. So that's that idea of accumulated authorship. I'll talk to you a little bit about violence against journalists now. So Abby Wright in the documentary, There's More Than You Could Ever Use. Indeed. During the Second Intifada, the director of the Israeli government press office was named Daniel Seaman, and he was a garrulous man. He probably still is. And so he always was saying these things which shocked me because they signaled quite directly that he would explicitly say things that he was more concerned about protecting soldiers than worrying about not just about free press, but also about journalist safety. And he was very explicit about it, even though he was coming from the government press office, which actually is in charge of issuing press cards to foreign correspondents and to Palestinian journalists. So I examined two ways in which Israeli authorities inhibited Palestinians' ability to speak as journalists. Those two ways are rescinding the government press office press cards to Palestinian journalists and shootings of journalists. And the interesting thing is, even though these seem like two very different things, in fact, they operate in similar ways. Okay? So, for example, rescinding the press cards to Palestinian journalists restricts their movement because the press cards were used to allow Palestinian journalists to get through checkpoints and also to go into East Jerusalem and into Israel. So once they didn't have those cards, they couldn't, for example, go to their home bureaus. And they just couldn't travel as quickly through the West Bank. So that limits news production. And in some complicated way, it also might malign Palestinian journalists' claims to professionalism and objectivity. So one reason why you all are listening to me with some, as though I'm some kind of an expert, is not only because I can come here, right, and speak to you, but also because I've been able to go to a lot of different places and see a lot of different things and report on them. If I was stuck in one city or a few cities most of the time, the sense of not just objectivity, but the sense of sort of perspective would be very different, right? So when you limit people's ability to move, you, in a sense, limit their claim to having broad and general knowledge. The shootings of journalists work in similar ways. Of course, fundamentally, the biggest difference is that it harms journalists. It harms their families and their friends and their communities. In addition to that, it also limits news production, though. And in a similar way, it maligns Palestinian journalists' claims to professionalism and objectivity. Because once somebody has been, injured, it's much harder to think of them as somebody who's potentially objective, because they're clearly been hurt by the struggle. Right now, these are complicated issues, and so that's why I say it maligns their claims to professionalism and objectivity, given sort of the structures of professionalism and objectivity that are already in place. I don't think that it actually necessarily inhibits their work or their ability to be a good journalist at all. I think, journalists have been shot and injured and gone on to do amazing work. So really the problem is with our structures of objectivity and professionalism, perhaps. So given all of these challenges, what do Palestinian journalists do? One thing I want to talk about is the special skills that Palestinian journalists have as they do their work. So why do U.S. foreign correspondents need all of these Palestinians to work with them, right? The most simple answer, of course, is language. But it's much more complicated than that. Palestinian journalists have a lot of different skills that American journalists may not have to the same extent. So, and one of the things I want to talk about is the ways in which intellectual labor comes together with embodied labor. They're integrated in the way that journalists work. So you saw how Mazen, Dana, and his colleagues managed to hold on to the cameras as the settlers were attacking them, right? That's certainly an embodied labor. They positioned themselves carefully at demonstrations and funerals, which means, for example, not only positioning themselves in a way that they can try to stay safe, but also, for example, at funerals, covering a funeral requires a certain kind of a social knowledge and embodiment that, for example, I would have a lot of trouble carrying out. So, for example, getting really close to the body as the body's being buried, taking pictures of people who are in agony and grieving. So that's an embodied thing. You have to have the skills to do that, and in a way the practice and the social networks. And then simple things like scaling piles of dirt to evade closures, or realizing that yesterday's rubble is today's tripod stand. Okay. And again, just to underscore the ways in which the intellectual and the embodied are integrated with each other. So here's a journalist being detained by the army, and he's handcuffed in an awkward way to the jeep. Despite this, Abed Kusini, this is this journalist, managed to call his office and to say, I'm being detained here, and so on and so forth. Now, him being able to do that is not that his office is going to send emergency forces to free him. It's kind of a performance. Like, I'm a journalist. I will get this done by speaking. You may be treating me like a person who can just be handcuffed in an awkward way, you know, and that I'm completely under your control. But actually, I have a little bit of power here, and I'm going to produce that power by speaking in this particular way. So he's performing calmness under pressure. Other kinds of what I call skills of proximity. We often think about journalism as being something about disinterestedness and distance, but there's a kind of a complementary set of skills. Those American journalists couldn't have their disinterest and distance if it weren't for the Palestinians who have what I call skills of proximity. So, of course, speaking the language, including the dialect, knowing the terrain, which was no small thing at a time when there were hundreds of barriers to movement, and still are in the West Bank, but during the Second Intifada they were shifting, so it was really, really complicated. Having connections to Palestinian society, having a deep knowledge of history, including all the small, you know, political changes in political parties and so on and so forth that are quite hard to keep track of. Having experiences of different Palestinian cultures, knowing that you're going to be acting differently and expected to act differently in Ramallah than you are than in Hebron, and in a village differently than another village, right? Knowing how to establish rapport in the field. And most of these skills knit together intellectual and embodied skills. And, you know, something I could talk about more later if you're interested. Interestingly, these skills of proximity, the skills of being a good journalist, are also the skills of being an active participant in public life under military occupation. Something I can talk about more. Like, how do you handle a protest? You use some of these same skills if you're a participant as if you're a journalist. So, you got the sense earlier that Palestinian journalists are not actually able to determine the narratives that are produced from their labor, right? They provide facts to foreign correspondents. They can direct the foreign correspondent in this way or that. Sometimes they do have influence over an American journalist, but it's not an obvious, clear effect. So if that's the case, why are they doing this, given that it can cost them their lives? One thing I argue is that Palestinian journalists have what I call an ethics of practice. So even if they don't get to tell the stories as they would like to do, their work can be meaningful to them because of the process of doing the work itself. Because covering a protest means challenging the occupation with your own body. Traveling around the West Bank means building connections in a time of closure. There are not that many, particularly during the Second Intifada. For example, there are a lot of Palestinian journalists who are citizens of Israel. Most citizens of Israel don't get to travel around the West Bank for their work. But if you're a journalist, you do. And I know that for those journalists, it was very meaningful to them that they knew people in Jenin, in Ramallah, in Nablus, in Hebron, in Bethlehem, because of their work. So building connections itself is a political act under these conditions. And then also interviewing and visiting people who have suffered. That's something you do if you're a good civic activist or a good community member. And, you know, if you're a journalist, you do it too. You might ask different questions, and the visit might go a little bit differently, but there's still something important and meaningful to people about that. The second part of the book is actually about the ways in which U.S. journalism and international journalism in general, and I can talk to you about why that line is a little bit blurry for me in this particular study, how international journalism affects Palestinian politics and society on the ground. And it's something that I'm going to move through a little bit so that we have time for discussion. But basically, there was just so many tripods on the ground that people really had a sense of being watched and performing for international news. And also, there's an unusual configuration of the public sphere in the West Bank. Because, for example, when Palestinians are protesting against the wall, who are they really protesting for? Israeli authorities have built the wall unilaterally. I mean, there's been a few court cases that challenge little pieces of the wall, but it's not like there's a large-scale process of consultation, obviously. So who are people protesting for? In a sense, they're protesting for domestic audiences because they're reviving and maintaining a tradition of popular protest. In a sense, they're protesting for international audiences to gain solidarity. And in a sense, they're protesting, I'm sure, for Israeli audiences. But, I mean, this is a very complicated structure. And there's more to say about that. So media play an especially important role because of the complexity of this political situation. And because, again, because of the complexity of the situation, because there are so many people on the ground covering these stories, even before media are published, they can have social and political effects. So I talk at length in the book about these two images. of protest against the separation wall in Bethlehem. And, for example, for the one on the right, why was this poster produced? Why was the protest organized as it was? Why did the photojournalist take this picture? Why did the photojournalist show up at all? These are all interesting questions. And for this one, why, similar questions also, why did this young man confront this soldier in this way? I was at both of these protests and was able to talk to people involved with this. So to sort of do a long ethnography of the production of these images, they have a long pre-life. Seems that you just take an image in a second, but they have this long pre-life. And then I looked at the circulation of the images afterwards, in particular this one, which has actually been this guy's profile picture on Facebook, and other people's profile pictures on Facebook when they want to express their solidarity or affection or whatever for this young man, who was only 15 when this was taken, but now is much older. Okay, the last thing I want to talk to you about in depth is the graffiti on the separation wall, which for me sums up a lot of these ideas about whose voices we tend to hear in U.S. media, and also about the way in which the Israeli military occupation affects Palestinians' abilities to speak. So I was at this protest against the separation wall in 2004 in Abu Dis, and I got there early, as a good ethnographer will, and the bottom part of the wall had been painted white, as though to clear the path for more graffiti that day. So a little girl, about 12, goes up to the wall and she writes, "Children against the wall." And you can see that several photographers gathered around her to take a picture of her. And for me, this was a funny moment because obviously it's nice to see people involved with political expression and getting attention for it. But on the other hand, there's something really strange and unrealistic about this, right? It sounds like an election slogan, "Children against the wall," at a time when there are no effective elections, right? So what does this mean? What does it mean when people write on the wall? And what does it mean when people take pictures of writings on the wall? There were a lot of pictures of graffiti on the wall around this time. Here is one by a really incredible photojournalist named Kevin Freyer, also taken from Abu Dis. It says, "Peace comes by agreement, not separation." If you look at it, you notice the handwriting is really clear and calm. The language is very abstract. You can imagine this language working perhaps in other conflicts as well, right? It's very abstract. And the picture is made more powerful because you see these people peering from behind the wall, right? So it's a very powerful statement. When I saw it, though, I was sure that this graffito had been written by internationals and not by Palestinians. And thank goodness I was an obsessive photographer at this time of graffiti, because I had in my archives this this image, or these two images, which I put together. "Peace comes by agreement, not separation," by Ireland for Peace. So indeed, it was written by internationals. And the other interesting thing about this image is that you can tell that the wall is not the full 8-meter wall. This is the wall that was sort of temporary. This was the barrier that was temporary before it was built at either 5 or 8 meters at this location. So you can see people are going around it. So the conditions of producing this image, where you can see the people peering through behind, are actually that the wall is not even completed. If the wall were completed, you couldn't take that image. You couldn't even say that. Kevin Freyer could not have said this if the wall were complete, because they closed the spaces. And there's a lot of images actually of graffiti and murals written by internationals with Palestinians in the foreground. And it's a very strange thing about voice, because you have a Palestinian presence but not a Palestinian voice. And that, I think, is very significant. Again, sort of speaking to the difficulty of Palestinians expressing themselves in the international media about their own lives and circumstances. So when Palestinians write on the wall, they might write something like this: "La budda lil-layl an yanjali, la budda lil-qayd an yankasir." Yet this does not make a really great picture for international media for two reasons. First of all, it's in Arabic. And second of all, even if you can read the Arabic and more or less understand it, you may not know that it's a reference to a very, very famous anti-colonial poem by the Tunisian anti-colonial poet Abu al-Qasim al-Shabi. So when Palestinians do write things that are powerful and eloquent on the wall, they require a lot more translation than some things that internationals would write. another barrier to expression. A final barrier is that the wall can't actually be thought of as a blank slate, because the wall, in the end, is actually the state, the space of the state. It's the space of the Israeli military occupation. So, for example, here is a graffito that perhaps says something about stopping injustice, but it was dismantled and reused as part of a lane marker at a checkpoint. This is like the way that it would direct traffic at a checkpoint to not go from this side to the other. So, you know, graffiti can be dismantled on the wall and used for other purposes. So in all of these ways, I just want to problematize the relationship between speech and state power. From 1967 to the beginning of the establishment of the Palestinian Authority in 1994, Israel censored every word that was published in the occupied territories, read everything, and decided whether or not it could be published, right? And that system melted away after 1994. And so it seemed in some ways like there was free press. Of course, the Palestinian Authority also attacked and criticized journalists and censored journalists. But from the Israeli side, in some senses, it seemed like there was free press. But you see here that because the Israeli military occupation continues, there's still a control, there's still ways in which Israeli control limits what Palestinians can say and what others can say. And then you can also see the dynamics between what internationals can say and what Palestinians can say. I'm going to move through that to tell you one more thing. Unfortunately, I have another ending point for this talk today, something which is not in my book. The graffiti stuff is the last bit in my book. This image is taken by Mohammed Laza, who is the same photographer who took the picture on the cover of my book that you saw at the very beginning. He's a 23-year-old photojournalist, and he also works as a teacher of media production to youth in Ida refugee camp. And this is a photograph that he took that's also in my book. Unfortunately, on Monday, last Monday, a week ago, April 8th, he was injured. It was a calm afternoon, and soldiers entered the camp. And he's going to be fine, thank God. But they came into the camp, it was calm. And he was working in the center, which is right next to the road that the soldiers were coming down. So really good positioning for a journalist to be able to, and for a media worker, photographer, to be able to stand up from his desk, walk out to the patio, the balcony, and start taking pictures, which is what he did. And the soldiers told him, these are some of the pictures he took that day. Soldiers told him to stop taking pictures. And he's like a funny guy, a really smart, funny guy. So he said, "You want me to stop shooting? You guys are the ones that are shooting. I'm just taking pictures." But he did go inside. He closed the door, and he just kept enough space open to take pictures. So he continued taking pictures. He took this picture, and about 10 minutes later, by this time, kids had been gathering to protest Israeli presence in their camps, and this soldier shot him in the face and shattered his right cheekbone. And he is going to be okay, but he's had a lot of operations already, and he's obviously got a long path to recovery. For me, he's a collaborator and a friend, obviously. And for me, this is a strange, obviously full circle moment for this project. One of the first things I did when I found out that he was injured was that I called the Committee to Protect Journalists. I called Reporters Without Borders. One feels obviously very helpless in these circumstances. I think also an interesting thing about this story is that Mohammed is doing very different work in some ways than Mazen. Mazen was doing work that was seen all around the world on a daily basis through Reuters. Mohammed Laza, quite young, 23. What he's been doing over the last 6 months has been photographing a very local uprising in Ida refugee camp against the wall. This is really brave work, and it's really important to his community because they don't get to see images of their resistance. They don't get to see what they can do, and he has been providing people with those images, and that's very, very important. And it's also very important that he teaches youth photography and documentary production. His work is going to be screening next week at the Chicago Palestine Film Festival, a documentary of his that he made about water. There's a severe water crisis in his home community of Ida refugee camp, has actually mobilized an international movement for environmental justice. So it just calls attention to me to the different ways in which journalists obviously support their home communities and communities of people all around the world who need to learn about this conflict. So today I'll leave you with warm wishes for his recovery, and I'm really excited to hear also from you, obviously, questions about the presentation and the work. Thank you. I think that it's a really important point, right? So one reason why there's so many murals like this and like this on the wall is that internationals come and they like to make murals on the wall. Palestinians, for the most part, at this point, do not like to make murals on the wall because they don't want to beautify the wall, right? An activist that I spoke to said, listen, the flowers that one could paint on the wall are not more beautiful than the olive trees that were uprooted to build it, right? So that's why you see, I mean, Palestinians are wonderful muralists. They have a wonderful mural tradition, right? But you often see those murals inside the walls of a community or a camp rather than on the wall itself. So, and that's why you see the graffiti on the wall, which is, you know, a little less easy to interpret. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, Blake Selzer with CARE. Thank you for your presentation. And to the point on the wall, actually, the one you had of the balloons, Banksy, granted he's international and he's very well known, he's not Palestinian, but in his intro to his book, he talks about painting something on the wall, and a Palestinian came up to him and said, what are you doing? He said, do you like it? He said, no, I don't like it. It's making our wall beautiful. So that was another example of that same thing. Yeah. But my question was more about the journalists and, you know, as an American myself here, I want to get your thoughts on first the story you told of the photographer, the 23-year-old in the Ida camp. I hadn't heard about it. My guess is because he's Palestinian, not an American. Otherwise, we hopefully would have, but or maybe not. But your thoughts on the recent New York Times Sunday magazine section by Ben, or I don't know if you saw the Intifada one. Yeah, my question is what you thought about that. And knee-jerk reaction here is even the words Intifada, everyone thinks it was about a violent protest. It was actually the opposite, but just want to get your thoughts on that. Yeah, no, I think it's a really important article. I know many people who say that they think it was one of the most important articles published about this conflict in years and years. It's really important that there be space, obviously, for Palestinian popular resistance, which is what that is. I think it's phenomenal that there was pretty good in-depth coverage in the New York Times about arrests and the tolls that they take. So I think that's a phenomenal piece. I think the stuff going on in Bab Shems is very interesting. The stuff that's going on in Ida refugee camp is interesting as well because it doesn't quite fit the Bab Shems model at any rate. Ida camp is deeply militarized, as indicated by the fact that my friend could get shot in the face on a completely calm afternoon, and other shootings as well. He's not the only one, unfortunately. So I think one thing we need to think about moving forward is all of our roles as journalists, as ethnographers, and other people in representing different modes of resistance and different kinds of popular resistance. Yeah, because I think that there needs to be ways to talk about the relationship to each other and bring them together.
You know, one question that I had for you, Emma, that we sort of started to talk about a little bit before your talk, but I'll expand on it a little bit. Did you look at sort of the difference between television journalism and print journalism, and whether or not, you know, between those two mediums, the role that Palestinians had in affecting the narrative changed in one or the other?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. Well, I should say, I know that it's disconcerting and strange when I talk about international news or U.S. news, and when I don't break down the difference between print media and television and radio. One reason I don't break it down too much is because a Palestinian journalist or fixer or producer might work for multiple platforms, right? So, and also from the perspective of Palestinians at a protest, they see reporters oftentimes as a group, right? So on the ground, in terms of practice, there's a blurring of those boundaries. I think certainly, for the most part, long-form journalism, written, print, leaves the most space for interpretation and analysis. And and also journalists who are stationed at a place for a longer amount of time obviously learn more about it. They also tend to create better relationships with their Palestinian and I presume also their Israeli colleagues, and so perhaps they can rely on their partners more because they know somebody well, right? So I think there's more of a chance perhaps for Palestinians to get their perspectives through in those kinds of circumstances. Yeah.
We'll go here and then we'll go right there. Go ahead, Mary.
Thanks very much for your talk, Amahl. I wanted to ask you to say a little bit more about Palestinian attitudes about international journalism and about Palestinians working in the context of and for international journalists, because of course it's a complicated terrain where people want their story out, want coverage, but also I think have a strong sense of the inadequacy and very often to use a word that I tell my students never to use, the bias of the coverage against them. And so I'm wondering, I mean, one, you could say a little bit more about that sort of general attitude, but also more specifically, so how do people look at or feel about Palestinians working in this environment? I mean, people obviously have very conflicted attitudes about people working for the aid community, for NGOs. How does journalism figure in this sort of landscape?
I think that, there's some of the same ambivalence about what journalists can do in these contexts. I think a lot of times journalists are in dialogue with community members about that, and they will say things like, well, it's better that I should, work for a major U.S. news outlet and shape things just a little bit than work for some outlet in the Gulf. What are they going to do? Kind of a thing, right? I know that activists often get frustrated with journalists who work for international media. They recognize that they're working under circumstances of constraint, but sometimes they say, well, okay, they're constrained, but they could have put this quote in, or they could have framed it this way, or they should have checked this, or they should have pushed it with their editors. And I mean, even among journalists, there's differences of opinion around how activist one should be with your own employer. And I think it depends on people's financial constraints, institutional constraints, also their language skills sometimes. Sometimes journalists aren't able to read in English what's printed or to understand all the nuances of it. So there's a lot of constraints on that. In terms of, what was the other part about, is that it? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. This was really stimulating, exciting. It's great work. You had mentioned that you wanted to, or that you could complicate the distinction between fixer and producer, and I would just love to hear a little bit more about that.
Oh, great. I mean, so fixer is a very broad category. It means people who are, setting up interviews, doing translation, also often working as guides, things like this. Producers actually do much the same work. Producers tend to work for TV, and fixers tend to work for print. So producers have more status than fixers. I think probably because writing is often thought of as a solitary activity. So it's just imagined that the foreign correspondent is doing all the work on her own, whereas there's no sense that a TV person could do that. They need a crew. They need all these other people around them, right? So maybe just in the sort of the practical level, there's more of an obvious place for the role of producer in TV than in print. In usage of the term, sometimes a high-status fixer who works for print will say, I'm a producer. So it's also just a hierarchy of terms. Yeah.